So these are the cams that sit in the right hand side of the engine, and you can see that they're a single unit. So you've got a shaft with a camshaft on it and the gears, and these bushes, these bearing surfaces here run in bushes in the engine housing, and the other side runs in bushes that are in the engine casing. As I say, they're integral units and they're very, very straightforward. There's not a whole lot you can do with them, but just need to make sure they're in reasonably good condition and that these surfaces are okay. When you put them into the engine, they're really, really easy to time. I just love these things. So this is the gear pinion on the end of the crankshaft. You can see that I've put in a nylock nut on the end of it, and this is to make sure that there's a bearing surface that pushes against the outside of the casing that fits on the outside of all of this, because that is the feed of oil into the main journal bearing. So you need to make sure you have a seal here that stops the oil from obviously popping down here. You need to make sure it goes straight the way through. When you put the camshafts onto the engine, it's very, very straightforward. You can't mix them up. This camshaft has also got a straight section on the end of it, and on here you can see this has got an eccentric section on the end of this part here. This eccentric section is there to operate the oil pump. So as the shaft turns around, that eccentric section basically pushes a bar backwards and forwards, and that bar operates the oil pump, and I'll show you that in a minute. In terms of setting the cams and making sure that the timing is correct, it's very straightforward. You just line these dots up. This is the exhaust camshaft, and so you line the exhaust dot up with that dot, and that dot lines up with the inlet on the inlet cam. Ignore these because they're just these gears are identical, and so basically they have the same stampings on them. But when you've got the inlet gear must have the dot lined up, and the exhaust gear must have that dot lined up, and you can't go wrong. That is the casing fitting on the outside, so that has all the bushes that hold the gears, and it also has this oil pump on the side, and there's that bar that shuttles backwards and forwards on the end of the eccentric piece at the end of that the shaft that I showed you earlier. So it has two pumps. The larger pump is on the right hand side, and that's the scavenge pump, and what that does is that takes oil from the bottom of the engine, from the dry sump, from that pipe that I showed you earlier on the engine casings, and it pumps that oil back through a pipe that goes up here and into this banjo bolt here, into the big oil tank that sits on the side of the bike. The smaller pump takes oil from the bottom of that oil tank, and it then pumps the oil through the lubrication system, and then feeds back, also drips back down into the sump and is sucked up. The way that this works is the right hand side pump, the scavenge pump, is bigger than the feed pump, so therefore you're always getting more oil taken out of the bottom of the engine than is pumped into the bottom of the engine. Obviously if it was the other way around, you would just fill the bottom of the engine up with oil and you wouldn't be able to then have any oil to feed the system. So the smaller pump is the one that actually feeds the engine. Up here you can see that there's, you can just about see that, I think, the adjusting nut for the end of the Magneto, and there's a little window so you can take that off and you can adjust the Magneto separately from when you've got the bike apart, so you don't have to take the whole casing off to adjust that gear. And that is the bike itself all put back together. I'll try and show some parts on here that might be of interest to you. Here's the oil tank. You can see that there is an oil feed from the bottom going into this block. That block just feeds the pumps that I just showed you. And you can see this other line here that goes back up and feeds into the top of the tank. When you open the oil filler and the engine is running, you should be able to see oil returning back to the tank, and that's a good sign because that shows two things are happening. Firstly, that you're getting oil from the tank into the primary pump and it's being pumped through the engine, and then the oil is then coming back down to the sump and is being pumped back up again. So you at least know that the scavenge pump is working. The way that you check that everything else is running correctly is to make sure that this little adjuster at the top here is receiving oil. That's the highest part of the engine. That's where you expect to see the lowest oil pressure, but that's where you've got that little adjuster. And so if you can see oil coming in through this section here, you know that the primary oil pump is working, and if you see oil coming back into this tank, you know that the secondary pump is working. The gear lever linkage is just very, very, very straightforward to put up, and the carburetor itself there's a separate video on how the carburetor gets put together, but again that's a very, very simple device. And you can see there's just a tiny little cap there that goes over the hole for the Magneto. So what you do is you set the bike at top dead center, you wind it back a couple of degrees, you then make sure the magneto is in the right position, like we showed you slightly in the earlier video, and then you just tighten that little nut on that was on the last slide, and that then locks that gear onto the magneto shaft, and the timing should be just about right. There is a video of this bike being started. It did take a little bit of fettling to get it started. That was mainly to get the mixtures right. I hadn't set the pilot screw correctly on the carburetor. But that is my 250cc L21 Triumph from 1934, completely rebuilt and ready to go. Thanks for watching.